Shalom, brothers and sisters. Welcome back to the channel. We've just completed the Passover and unleavened bread season, and I hope and pray you all had an enlightening and revealing time with your families or in whatever congregation or assembly you celebrated, or even if you celebrated alone. As I always say, I believe it's important when we're returning to the Most High to honor his Moedims in the best way that we can, whether that be collectively or individually. And of course, he will always judge the intent of what we do. And so I want to talk about a feast that is not very often covered when it comes to the Most High's Moedims, because it is a feast that doesn't come with a lot of instruction in the modern day sense when we consider the offerings that the feast of the shadow type would produce. As I always say, all the feasts of the Most High are feasts where it is about the agriculture and the harvesting of produce, the wheat produce, the fruit produce, the oil produce, the wine produce, which also comes from the fruit. And these types of harvests all throughout the season are what our forefathers did. But they were only a shadow of that which is to come. And the real identification of the feasts are always a harvesting of souls. And that's what the plan of salvation shows us when we look at the various feasts and what they represent. They represent in real type a harvesting of souls. So today I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the first fruits feast and the importance of it, what it means for us today, and how we can commemorate it as best as possible. Because as I say, when we look at the feast in Leviticus 23, we see instructions for various different types of feasts, what you should do, holy convocations, etc., etc. But on this particular feast, on the Feast of First Fruits, apart from the original instructions during the time when they were doing the feasts from an agricultural point of view, in our modern day now, knowing that Mashiach is our perfect fulfillment of the feast in real type, we now have to understand what it means for us today and how we best keep those Moedims of the Most High. So we'll have a small teaching or a short teaching on this particular feast of the first fruits, which hopefully will give some more insight and understanding to the feast. So let's get into it. So what is the Feast of First Fruits? How do we identify it on the calendar? What does it mean for us today? And how do we best commemorate it? And these are important things that we have to understand because, as I say, when we look at the instructions in Leviticus 23, we don't actually have any particular instructions for the feast in terms of it being a high Sabbath or it being a day for a holy convocation. Those type of things are not listed. And so we have to use wisdom, and we have to use the understanding of what the feast represents to give us an idea as to how to commemorate it or how best to celebrate it, because of course it is a listed feast in Leviticus 23, something we'll look at right now. So what is the festival of first fruits? Where do we find it on the calendar? How do we identify when it starts? What does it represent? And how do we commemorate it today? Because when we look in Leviticus chapter 23, which we'll see in a moment, we see the instructions for the various feasts, and the Feast of First Fruits is probably the feast that has the least amount of instructions in terms of it not being a high Sabbath day or a holy convocation, not given any particular instructions which we would relate to in today's age. Now, in the times of our ancestors, it was a feast that had instructions because they had to do their various agricultural offerings, bringing the sheaf of the first fruit of their produce. So the first fruit feast was actually a very relevant feast to them in those times in terms of what they had to do. But now we are applying the feast in the spiritual sense with the death, burial, and resurrection of Messiah, who has fulfilled the feasts. We have to understand what it means for us today and how best to commemorate it. And as I said at the beginning, it's probably one of the feasts that has the least amount of instruction or teaching on it for us in modern day terms. And so this teaching by Yah's grace will give you some understanding. So let's look at Leviticus chapter 23 and remember that Yahweh's feast days are given to us in chronological order because Yahweh is an Elohim of order. And this is very important for us to understand when it comes to recognizing where the feast actually falls, because there are many people who get mixed up as to when this feast actually starts, and that is because they are not following the chronological order that Elohim Yahweh has given us so we can understand his instructions perfectly. But if we remember that our Father in heaven, Yah, is not the author of confusion, but of peace, as in all assemblies of the saints. 1 Corinthians 14 and 33. So we have to keep this at the forefront of our mind, that Yah is not the author of confusion. He is an Elohim of order. And therefore, when he gives us instructions, they are always orderly and they are always specific to following them to the letter in order for us to be compliant with his will. So let's look at Leviticus chapter 23, verses 1 and 2, where Yahweh spake unto Moshe, saying, Speak unto the children of Yasharal, and say unto them, Concerning the feast of Yahweh, which ye shall proclaim to be holy convocations, even these are my feasts. So he introduced us to the feast, and he tells Moshe to speak to the children of Yasharal to let them know that these are the feasts of Yahweh, that they must proclaim as holy convocations, the instructions thereof within the due seasons, and they are the feasts of Yahweh. They're not the feasts of man, they're not the feast of the Jews, they're not the feast of the Yasharelites, they are the feasts of Yahweh. And so he then proceeds to give us the instructions with all the feasts, starting with the Passover in Leviticus 23 and 5. And he goes on to tell us about unleavened bread in Leviticus 23, 6 to 8. He goes on to tell us about firstfruits, the one that we are looking at today in Leviticus 23, 10 through to 14. Then he tells us about Shavuot, or the Feast of Weeks, or Pentecost as some call it, Leviticus 23, 15 to 16. He goes on to tell us about the Feast of Trumpets, Leviticus 23 and 24, and he tells us about the Day of Atonement, Leviticus 23, 27 through to 32. He tells us then about the Feast of Tabernacles in Leviticus 23, 34 through to 36. And finally, he tells us about the last day, or the 8th day, the last great day, in Leviticus 23 verse 39. So these are the feasts of Yahweh that he tells us various instructions, various dates, so on and so forth, all of it listed in Leviticus 23 that you can obviously read in your own time. And so when we come to the Feast of Firstfruits, this is the feast, as I've said already, that has least amount of instruction, and is probably the one that most people trip up on in modern day times. And it is important for us to get it right, because if we get the wrong feast of firstfruits, we are going to then mess up getting the right date for the Feast of Shavuot, which is the next feast after the first fruits. So the first fruit comes with instruction which tells us how to get to the Feast of Weeks, or the Feast of Shavuot, but we need to understand exactly what the feast means and how to identify it. And at the end of Leviticus 23 in verse 44, Moshe declared unto the children of Yasharal the feast of Yahweh. So he told the children of Yasharal the various instruction, and to not get it wrong, these are Yah's feasts. These are feasts of the Most High. So once we have that understanding, we can then proceed to see and identify the feast of firstfruits. And as I said at the beginning, Yahweh's feast days are given to us in chronological order, because he, Yahweh, is an Elohim of order. And so when we look at the instructions in Leviticus 23 and the various verses, we see they are all in a chronological order. And if we identify firstfruits in that order, it is the third feast of the Most High's Moedim's season. So it's the third feast on the list. So let's go to the restored biblical calendar. Now, if you saw the recent teaching about how Messiah is our Passover lamb who fulfills our calendar, you would have seen the explanation of Messiah's Passover week. If you haven't seen the teaching, the link will be in the description and the pinned comment section. But ultimately, we saw Messiah fulfill his Passover week, being the Passover lamb, being the unleavened bread, until his resurrection and eventual appearance to his disciples, which took place on the first day of the week, when they came to the tomb early in the morning and found he was already risen, and then he revealed himself later on. And so that particular day was on the 19th day of the first biblical month, when he was found not in the tomb, when they went there very early in the morning on the first day of the week. And so many people believe that that particular date was the Feast of Firstfruits, because it was the first day of the week after he was found resurrected. But what we have to understand is that feast day was still during the week of unleavened bread. Unleavened bread being the 7-day feast, which started on the 15th of the first biblical month here and continues until the 21st of the first biblical month here, which is the high Sabbath day. So when they came to the tomb and found Messiah not there on the first day of the week, they were still during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which on our calendar would be the 5th day. Some people believe it was on the 4th day of unleavened bread, but it was still during unleavened bread. Now that means that if the feast day was still during unleavened bread, it cannot be the Feast of Firstfruits, because we have already seen, according to our list, that Firstfruits, the third feast in Leviticus chapter 23, comes after unleavened bread. When the Most High gives us instructions, he gives us the instructions after the unleavened bread season is over. And as we know, him being an Elohim of order, not of confusion, he can't put first fruits bang in the middle of unleavened bread, because that particular feast hasn't finished. It hasn't been commemorated to its fullest letter of the law. And the Most High gives us the instruction to keep the feast as the high Sabbath, talking of unleavened bread here, on the first day of the feast, which is the 15th day of the first biblical month, and the high Sabbath on the 21st day, which is the 7th day of the feast on the first biblical month. So there is no way we can have first fruit before the Feast of Unleavened Bread concludes, because that would not be orderly. And the instructions that we are given, which again are in a chronological order, gives us the instructions after unleavened bread. So this particular date, although it was the date when Mashiach was discovered no longer in the tomb, having already resurrected previously, Mashiach is the wave sheaf offering, because he had to present himself in the heavens to the Father. This is something that he said to Miriam in the book of Yochanan when she went to touch him, and he said, "Touch me not, for I have not yet ascended to my Father." He had to ascend to his Father, present himself as the perfect wave sheaf offering and the first of the first fruit offering, because he is the first person to resurrect from the dead as a spiritual being, as a fully spiritual being with physical capabilities. And so because of all of this date, what he did all of those things, was not the date of first fruits. Note that first fruit is plural, meaning there are multiple fruits to be harvested on that day. Messiah is singular. So even though he is a first fruit, singular, he is not a first fruits plural, because there is only one Messiah. But he has accomplished something that will then allow there to be multiple first fruits after him being the first of the first fruits, and then will come multiple others after him. And that's all because of what he accomplished by conquering death and by taking the keys of Hades, or the keys of Sheol, and being the one who now controls those things. He has full control over those that go into that realm and those that resurrect out of that realm. So he is, of course, the first fruit, and of course he is the wave sheaf offering. But the actual feast of first fruits did not take place here because, as I've said already, they were still in the middle of unleavened bread. And so the actual date of first fruits, which we will see in the instructions in a moment, is the first Sabbath after unleavened bread has finished. So unleavened bread finishes here. You go to the first Sabbath after unleavened bread finishes, which would be here. And on the morrow, the next day, the day after, the first day of the week, that date would make the first fruit feast that we see in Leviticus chapter 23. And so this is important to get right, because when we look at the instructions about how to then count to the next feast, we are told to number 7 Sabbaths. And so if we were to get the feast wrong, i.e. on this day, then our count would literally start a week early, because we would start counting our 7 Sabbaths from here. But because this is the correct date of the feast, by the time we start counting our 7th Sabbaths, we find that the first Sabbath falls in the second biblical month, and then we count 7 Sabbaths, and the following day after the 7th Sabbath, on the morrow, the first day of the week, that would then become the 4th feast, which is Shavuot or Pentecost or the Feast of Weeks. So very important to get the correct understanding of when the feast falls. And now let's look at what it represents. So we've seen our feasts listed in Leviticus chapter 23, and first fruits being the feast that we are focusing on today. We are going to see some instructions, and whilst we read the instructions, if we look at it with a spiritual hat on, we will see that the first fruits feast is about the multiple harvests after Messiah's death, burial, and resurrection. And so that is what will give us the clue, because when we see the instructions, it will tell us who Messiah is speaking to, who the Most High is speaking to, who are those people that are classed as the first fruits plural. So in Leviticus chapter 23 verse 10, it says, "Speak unto the children of Yasharal, and say unto them, when ye be come into the land which I give unto you, and shall reap the harvest thereof, then ye shall bring a sheaf of the first fruit of your harvest unto the priest." And verse 11 says, "And he," that is the priest, "shall wave the sheaf before Yahweh to be accepted for you on the morrow after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it." So the children of Yasharal, when they come into the land, this is talking about the original instruction that they have given by the Most High, and they reap the harvest thereof, i.e. the first harvest of that land, the first produce. They are to bring a sheaf of the first fruits of the harvest unto the priest. Now, the priest in previous times, talking about in times when these instructions were instigated, was talking about the high priest, the sons of Levi, who were the priesthood. So, for example, Aaron, Moses' brother, was the high priest at that time. And so they would bring their produce to Aaron, and Aaron would take the produce of their first fruits, the sheaf of that produce, and he would wave it before Yahweh, the Most High, and it would be accepted for them on their behalf. And that would be done on the morrow after the Sabbath. So the day after the Sabbath is when the priest would wave this sheaf. But note, as I explained before, the day after the Sabbath would have to be once the feast of unleavened bread had finished. It couldn't be the Sabbath during unleavened bread, because you're going on to a new feast without completing the previous feast. That would make no sense for it to be so. But rather, when unleavened bread has finished, the first Sabbath you find after unleavened bread, the day after, i.e. on the morrow, that is the day that the high priest would wave the sheaf on behalf of the children of Yasharal. So this was something the high priest was doing on behalf of the children of Yasharal. Now we should understand that in our modern day times, or after the death, burial, and resurrection of Messiah, he is now the only high priest. So if we read this verse again, thinking about Yahweh being our salvation, our Messiah, Yahweh's salvation, we should understand that he is the only high priest. So reading the scripture again in light of today, we would say, speak unto the children of Yasharah and say unto them, when you come into the land which I give you, and shall reap the harvest thereof, and ye shall bring a sheaf of the first fruit of your harvest unto Yahweh's salvation, our Messiah, and Yahweh's salvation, our Messiah, shall wave the sheaf before Yahweh to be accepted for you on the morrow after the Sabbath. Yahweh's salvation shall wave it. So it is the Most High Son, his salvation, who is doing this thing on our behalf. We are bringing the sheaf of our first fruits to him, and he is waving it before the Father in heaven on our behalf. And he's doing it the day after the Sabbath, once unleavened bread has been completed. On the morrow after the Sabbath of unleavened bread, once that has finished. So that should help us to identify the correct date for the Feast of First Fruits. Now, Messiah made a very important statement in John chapter 12, and this statement that he made should give us the understanding what the Feast of First Fruits represents and why it is so, how it has become so, because Messiah has made it so. So in John chapter 12, verse 24, Messiah said, verily, verily, I say unto you, except a corn of wheat fall into the ground and die, it abideth alone. But if it die, it bringeth forth much fruit. So what Messiah is saying is that unless a corn of wheat, in this particular case, in this example he gives, he uses a corn of wheat. He says, unless it falls into the ground and dies, it would be alone, it abideth alone. But if it dies, then it would bring forth much fruit. So in other words, if a corn of wheat, a singular corn of wheat, was to fall into the ground, if it dies, that wheat would then produce multiple other wheat. In other words, the ground would then take that wheat, it will almost be replanted with the multiple seeds, and rather than just having one corn of wheat, you would get multiple corns of wheat. But if that corn of wheat was to go into the ground and you harvest it on its own, it would not have the chance to reproduce others after its kind. And so this statement is important in relation to first fruits, because Messiah is showing us before his death, burial, and resurrection that unless he was to go into the grave, i.e. taste death, and then resurrect, there would not be an opportunity for any others to come after him, because nobody is able to come up from the grave on their own. It takes him having to die as the perfect sacrifice and having to resurrect at the appointed time to then be able to replicate that process with multiple other harvests, i.e. harvests of souls. And so this statement in itself is very important to show us that first fruits is a plural feast about multiple harvests, and that is only possible because the singular corn, i.e. Messiah, the singular corn of wheat in this example that he gives, went into the ground and died. And then, of course, after 3 days and 3 nights resurrected. And by him doing that, he allows the remnant of the corn that are still in the grave, i.e. the other souls, to also be resurrected after him. But he has to be first. And so this statement tells us that the Feast of First Fruits is about what Messiah did in order to be able to have multiple other souls harvested as first fruits, but they have to come in their order. And this is something we then see in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, starting in verse 20, where it says, but now is Messiah risen from the dead and become the first fruits of them that slept. For since by man came death, by man came also the resurrection of the dead. For as in Adam all die, Even so, in Messiah shall all be made alive. So all died through Adam and his transgression and passing on sin defect to all his descendants. But even so, in Messiah, for his perfect and finished works, all shall be made alive. Those who accept Messiah shall be made alive. So we see very clear language here that it is because of Messiah's sacrifice and because of his resurrection that now allows first fruits to be fulfilled, for there to be multiple first fruits. But Messiah singular is the one that has to go first, as he did. And in verse 23 tells us, but every man in his own order. And I've explained this multiple times on other teaching. It should read Messiah number 1, the first fruits number 2, and afterwards they that are messiahs at his coming, number 3. So there are ultimately 3 groups, Messiah being the first group, a standalone group, because of what we see in John 12:24, that he had to go into the ground and die alone in order then to bring forth much fruit after him. So Messiah is the first group, and then it is the first fruits as a group who are next. They are the second group, and the first fruit is the feast that is being celebrated because of Messiah's finished work. So Messiah first, the first fruit second, and later on, when Messiah comes back, he will then harvest multiple other fruits, which would be the third group, which is at his coming. So with this understanding, we can now clearly see that first fruits as a feast is a feast that is commemorated because of the finished works of Messiah. And though he is a first fruit singular, he is not a first fruit plural. The first fruit plural, which is the actual feast we are celebrating, are the souls that came after Messiah's death, burial, and resurrection. And that's something we will see in a moment. So as we go back to our calendar here, we see the instruction now that we have read these instructions, and we can now apply it to the calendar where the children of Yasharal are told that when they come into the land given to them by the Most High and they reap the harvest, then shall they bring a sheaf of the first fruit of their harvest unto the priest. So the priest is Messiah, and he shall wave the sheaf before Yahweh to be accepted for you. On the morrow after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it. So Messiah has to present to the Most High the first fruit, being the souls that were harvested. We find those in Matthew chapter 27, verses 52 and 53. And it is done when? On the morrow after the Sabbath. What Sabbath is he talking about? He can't be talking about this Sabbath here, because this Sabbath here is still during unleavened bread. It is in the middle of unleavened bread. So he can't be talking about the day after the Sabbath, because that is still unleavened bread. Unleavened bread still has a couple of days to run up until the high Sabbath on the 21st day of the 7th biblical month. So when he says on the morrow after the Sabbath, he's talking about at the completion of unleavened bread. You then find the first available Sabbath, which would be here, the 25th day of the first biblical month. And he says on the morrow, i.e. tomorrow after that Sabbath, which is the 26th day of the first biblical month, that is when the priest shall wave that sheaf of offering, i.e. those resurrected souls, in front of Yahweh. And so that date is the date of the first fruits plural feast. And that is very important, because it then will start to formulate the count that we need to find the next feast after that, which is the Feast of Weeks in the third biblical month. And so this is super important to get right, because if we get this date wrong, not only do we keep the first fruit feast on the wrong day, we then keep the subsequent feast of Shavuot, or the Feast of Weeks, on multiple wrong days, because we are doing the counting according to the instructions and we start counting from the wrong date. But if we get this date right, then when we start counting for the Feast of Weeks, we will also get that date right, because we are following the instructions given to us in Leviticus 23, 15 and 16. So this is where we identify the Feast of First Fruits on the calendar, which is on the morrow, i.e. the day after the Sabbath, after unleavened bread has finished. The Most High is an Elohim of order, not of confusion. One feast does not start until the other feast has been completed. Very simple logic. And he gave it to us in chronological order, so there's no excuses for us to get it wrong. So, as we have seen, Messiah is the first of the first fruit. So, he is part of the first fruits, but he is the first of the first fruits, as he explained in John chapter 12, verse 24, that he had to go into the ground and die and be resurrected in order for him to produce multiple other harvests, just like himself. And so, he is the first of the first fruits, which means he, Messiah, is our Passover lamb, the one who was slain for the sins of the world, the Lamb of Yah that taketh away the sins of the world. And his sinless body is our unleavened bread. And unleavened bread, as we know, is a 7-day feast. So it's almost like taking a course of unleavened bread for the entire period of those 7 days. Only when you have completed that course of unleavened bread can you then become a first fruit harvest, because you have received Messiah in completion. So he is our unleavened bread, and Messiah is Yahweh's first fruit, singular, and enables who the Father chooses to be his first fruits, plural. So Messiah's singular works is making him the first of the first fruit, and then enabling those that would receive him, those who the Father chooses, to be his first fruits, plural. So Messiah is always first, and then the group of first fruits, which are also in multiple other groups, which we will see shortly. And that is why when we look on the calendar, that it is always the Sabbath after unleavened bread has finished. The day after, on the morrow after that Sabbath, is when the first fruit festival is celebrated. So we have to make sure that we understand this and get this right, because as I say, it will help us to be correct for the other feasts that come during the summer months. Now, who are the first fruits from a harvesting of souls perspective? I've already given you the answer when I talked about the saints that were resurrected after Messiah's death, burial, and resurrection, which we find in Matthew chapter 27, verses 52 to 53. These are the ones that came out of their graves and appeared to many in the city after Messiah's death, burial, and resurrection. They are likely to be the 24 elders that we see in Revelation chapter 4, verse 10. So these souls were already resurrected from the time Messiah had resurrected. They were resurrected on the first fruit day, i.e. the first Sabbath after unleavened bread had finished on the morrow, the following day, the first day of the week. So this first fruit harvest, this part of the first fruit harvest, has already been completed, has already been fulfilled. But the first fruits are not just a singular group. They fall into multiple groups. So you have the Old Testament patriarchs of old, the ones that we have seen that were resurrected, went into the city, the ones that, as I say, are more than likely the 24 elders who have already been converted. They've already been resurrected. They are already the first fruits. And then we have the 144,000 found in Revelation 14 and 4. So the 144,000 from the 12 tribes of Yasharal that the Most High has selected, they are also a first fruit, but they are a future first fruit, because this is something that we know happens during these end times. So there's a big gap between the first fruits, the first group of first fruits, i.e. the resurrected saints in Matthew 27, 52 to 53, to the 144,000. But nevertheless, as you read in Revelation 14 and 4, it tells you that these are first fruits unto Yahweh. So they are part of the first fruit group. And then there are others who are sealed before Messiah's coming, which you find in Revelation 6 and 6. though it uses some metaphoric language talking about hurt not the wine and the oil, but the wine and the oil, if you understand the Feast of Weeks, you will see that they are also people that are sealed during those times, who will be classed as first fruits because the Most High have sealed them to his good pleasure. Of course, he knows who they are. So these things are very important for us to understand, because then when we come to commemorating the feast, we know exactly what and why we are commemorating. And that's why we have to get the understanding of what the first fruit feast represents. So how do we celebrate first fruits? What do we do on that particular day? Well, we commemorate the day on the calendar. And again, as repeated multiple times, it is always the first day of the week after unleavened bread is over. So after unleavened bread is over, the first Sabbath that takes place, the day after, which is the first day of the week, would be the first fruit date, which we have already identified on the calendar. Unleavened bread finishes here. You find the first Sabbath after unleavened bread, which would be here. And the day after, on the morrow, which is here, the first day of the week, this becomes the date for first fruit. Always the same, year in, year out. We give a thanksgiving offering of praise, remembering what it said in John 12:24, remembering when Messiah gave the example of a sheaf of corn, a singular sheaf of corn. He said, going into the ground, he said, unless that sheaf of corn dies, then only can it produce multiple other sheaves of corn. But if that sheaf of corn in the ground doesn't die and you harvest it, how then will you get multiple other sheaves of corn? You won't be able to. And this is why this feast is so important, because it highlights that we only have the ability to become first fruits or to become harvested souls because of what Messiah did. If he didn't do what he did, none of us would have the opportunity to become first fruits or any other type of harvest, because we would have to remain in Sheol until judgment day, and then we would be judged and be found unworthy, and therefore would be sent to the lake of Gehenna. The only reason we avoid that fate is because Messiah has done it all for us. So by him being the perfect sacrifice, we should be grateful that after completing unleavened bread and after receiving Messiah as our savior, we now have the opportunity to become first fruits, or to become harvest as the Most High sees fit. And so we should really, after recognizing and commemorating the day on the calendar, we should really offer a thanksgiving of praise and prayer unto the Most High. Now, in times of old, they would bring forth an offering of their produce, and that's what the first fruit feast represents, when they bring forth an offering. Some people in modern days like to make an offering, whatever you choose to do, whatever the Most High leads you to do. But the most important offering we can give is from the fruit of our lips, when we offer up praises and thanks unto the Most High, remembering the things he has done for us, remembering his plan of salvation, and remember it is only possible because of the finished works of Messiah. Now, the day is not a commanded high Sabbath or holy convocation, but as we would do during a celebration, usually would entail food. So considering preparing a nice meal to celebrate. Again, it's not a commanded high Sabbath or holy convocation, so there's no obligation to have to do these things. But as we do with the people of the Most High, when we celebrate, we generally celebrate with food and drink. And so it is something we should do, whether collectively or individually, though it is not commanded as a holy convocation. And again, acknowledge that this day is about how Yahweh made it possible for you to be part of his first fruits harvest, or part of a harvest, even if you're not a first fruit harvest, but he has made it possible that you will be part of a harvest. Should you do what is right? Should you accept Messiah? Should Messiah be found in you? Should you be found in him? And that is only because of his finished works. So we have to acknowledge and celebrate this fact, because without this first fruit feast, we would not be able to be harvested because Messiah had to go first. As he said, except a sheaf of corn go into the ground and die, it abideth alone. And that is exactly what Messiah did. So by his resurrection, he now allows multiple others to have the same fate. Multiple other people can die, but be resurrected in the first resurrection and be converted unto Yahweh. And so this is a very important thing to do during commemorating the feast, because we are acknowledging it is all about Yahweh's plan of salvation. And then we use this day as a marker henceforth to start counting 7 Sabbaths, after which the following day, i.e. on the morrow, will be Shavuot, or the Feast of Weeks. So in Leviticus chapter 23 and verse 15, it tells us that from the Feast of Firstfruits, so the feast we are celebrating, from that day you then count 7 Sabbaths. And when you count 7 Sabbaths, the day after the 7th Sabbath would be the 50th day, and that day would then be the beginning of the Feast of Weeks, or Shavuot, or Pentecost. And that is why it's so important to commemorate this day, because this day serves as a marker that when we start counting the 7 Sabbaths, it will take us directly to Shavuot on the first day of the week after the 7th Sabbath count has been completed. And as I said earlier, if you get the wrong date of first fruits, then you're going to do the count too early, and you're going to get the wrong date of the subsequent feasts that follow. So this is the importance of celebrating the feast and understanding what it means and getting it on the right date, because then that will lead, by Yah's grace, to the correct observation of the following feasts that come throughout the summer and then into the fall. So we've come to the end of the teaching, hopefully one that has given us much understanding about the Feast of First Fruits, when to identify it on the calendar, what it means for us today, how to commemorate it, and then how to count from that feast the 7 Sabbaths, and then the following day, which will become the Feast of Weeks. As I said at the beginning, it's not a feast that gives much instruction in Leviticus 23 in modern terms. So by Yah's grace, this teaching will have put things into perspective, so you understand the importance of the feast and when to identify it, which helps us get the other feasts correct. So I hope the Most High will give you the understanding that is needed. Please do like and share. And for now, to all those that are his, may the Most High bless you and keep you.